Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. Coming up, we're going to talk to Dr. Mark Bruce, who's an emergency physician in Wisconsin, and then we're going to wrap up the show talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Wait till you hear this story. First, I think it's important to start here because this is it's kind of filed under the category of PSA, I guess, because there seems to be a consensus of sorts that's being built by the people who are going to make these decisions on what it's going to look like when we reopen. So whether you like this or not, we can have that conversation. But first, I think we need to know what they're thinking. So before we do that, I want to talk about some challenges that we're faced with right now. Because a lot of this sounds really pessimistic, and I kind of am, to be honest. I'm usually not about life, but I am about this. So this is Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former head of the FDA. He said, we are concerned that the public, the media, the business community, and policymakers are largely unprepared for a pessimistic scenario in which near ubiquitous testing is difficult to achieve. Infected individuals' antibodies do not lead to immunity. Antiviral treatments take longer to develop, and vaccines never arise. So those are four very difficult things. So let's talk about those here real quick. Testing is going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time to get. It's going to take a long time to make. It's going to take a long time to get super accurate. It's difficult to do. So yesterday we talked to Dr. Dahlia, and she just explained, you got to stick this giant swab in the back of your throat. It's got to get way back here, and you got to do it in both nostrils. It's like a hard test to do. It's not super pleasant. Also, antibodies may not be showing up in these blood tests all the time. There's this big backlog for lab results. I read an article in MIT Tech Review just this morning that results are taking 7 to 10 days or longer in some places. Now, that article was April 5th, so maybe things have gotten better, but I mean, gosh, in some ways you can see things even getting worse, taking even longer to get the test results back, an even bigger backlog. So it's very difficult to test as many people as we're saying we need to test, right? There's this idea like, oh, we need to test more. It's like, okay, yeah, but that's kind of hard to do. To do the same proportionally amount of tests that they did in South Korea, we would need to administer 1 million tests a day. And to properly retest over and over, Paul Romer, he's a Nobel Prize economist, he says we need 22 million tests a day. Now, I have no idea how he came up with that number, but the point is we need a lot. And right now, we're not even at 100,000. So even if we did 1 million, we need 10 times what we're doing right now. That's a big hurdle. It's going to take time. Second thing, the antibodies. Right? The antibodies may not even be productive. Let me quote here. This is from some doctors at Stanford. Many commentators are assuming that for the subset of infected patients who develop antibodies, that those antibodies will protect people from being reinfected. So that's an assumption that a lot of people have made. That's not true. In fact, maybe not be true. In fact, little is known about whether the antibodies are neutralizing, that is protective against subsequent infection. They go on, they talk about the 51 patients in South Korea. It's now 91, as of 2 days ago, where they tested positive for COVID, had 2 negative tests, and then had another, they got it again. And the doctors don't know whether or not it reemerged, or they got another strain of it, or they just got the same strain again, but their antibodies didn't work. We don't know what percentage of people this could be true for. These doctors say it's not an unusual phenomenon. It can happen with HIV. I mean, chickenpox is a good example. Dr. Dahlia yesterday brought up chickenpox. You get chickenpox when you're a kid, and it kind of stays dormant in you and can come back when you're an adult as shingles, right? So testing is going to be difficult. We don't even know if there's such thing as antibodies or how effective they really are. Vaccines take a long time. We've talked about that 100 times. Treatments, there's 150 treatments that are in trial right now, either preclinical or clinical, which is great. I think that's awesome. I'm glad we have 150, but that's going to take time to work. These are the Stanford doctors. Historically, antiviral medicines have proven much harder to develop than antibacterial medicines like antibiotics. While we now have effective medicines for HIV and Hep C, those took decades of research to develop. So the idea that we can just do it like that seems very, very optimistic. So I don't want to bum you out, but these are the realities of the situation. We don't have the testing to scale, and it's very difficult to do that. We're not even sure if there's such thing as immunity. There's no widespread treatments or cures, maybe promising potentials, but we're not there yet. And forget about vaccines, that's going to take years. So what do we do with that? That's our starting point. Now, let me try to be positive. Maybe this thing's not as virulent as we think. All right, the one researcher in Los Alamos we talked about the other day thinks the R0 is 5.7, which is way more viral than we think. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's not 3, like we've been talking. Maybe it's more like 1.5 or something, and it's a little more manageable. We still don't even know that. Let's hope that's the case. So that being said, here's the plan that politicians and public health officials are sort of rallying behind. We don't have timelines yet, but maybe starting in May, starting in a couple weeks. Every state may be a little different. But this is kind of what we're thinking. So first, not what I'm thinking. These are what the people who are going to make these decisions are thinking. So the first thought is younger and low-risk people, maybe under the age of 40. That seems to be an age cutoff that they've come up with. You're free to go. I know that sentence drives Jesse Kelly nuts, where you're like, you're free now. He had some tweet the other day. He's like, the conservatives went from don't tread on me to, please, master, may I please be released from my home? That's where we're at. So people under 40, younger people, healthy people under 40, you're free to go. Second, well, you're free to go and you might get sick. You might get really sick and you might die. Lower likelihood if you're younger and healthy, but might happen. But that's just the way that goes, right? Like we do that with driving. Everything's a risk, right? Driving's a risk. 40,000 people die every year from driving. I'm not comparing that to COVID. I'm comparing the cost-benefit analysis, like putting a price on a life, right? This idea of we're going to do everything we can so that not one person dies. It's like, come on, give me a break. 40,000 people a year die driving, and we weigh that out. We're like, well, geez, 40,000 people dying worth us all driving? And we've decided that, yes, it is. It's worth. Like, no one's like, we're not going to drive until there's not one death. Like, well, that's not realistic. So same thing with COVID. So people under 40, yes, some people may get really sick and die. But that's the trade-off. So we have to have that conversation. It's tough to have, but we got to have it. Okay, so that's first thing. Second, contact tracing. Oh, we've been talking about this for weeks. We haven't talked about it in about a week, but weeks ago we talked about this. So this is going to be a smartphone app on your phone. It's going to be through Bluetooth. Apple and Google are already setting this up. They're going to release it here soon. It's called a Bluetooth-based contact tracing platform. That's the term, contact tracing. So we'll talk more about this more detail another day, but Bluetooth, I guess, is safer for privacy than using your geo on your phone, like from satellite. So Bluetooth is safer privacy-wise, but it may not be as accurate because it can go through walls. So you may be in a Starbucks and someone in the McDonald's next door, it connects through the wall, even though, and that person had COVID at McDonald's, and you'll get an alert because you were near them, but there was a wall between you, right? So there's that issue that we'll have to figure out. Everything's a trade-off. But we told you this was coming. We told you this contact tracing was going to be a thing, and it will be very, very soon. Will you sign up for it? It's going to be opt-in at first, but then not enough people are going to opt in, so they're going to make you do it. So just get ready for that. They say that if we do 1 million tests a week with contact tracing, they think then that's enough to be effective. All right, number 3, schools are going to reopen except for kids who live with high-risk parents or grandparents. There'll be homeschool options for them, so schools are going to have to figure that one out. Work will reopen. Again, anyone under 40 is good to go. 40 to 65, they're suggesting you stay at home if you're more susceptible. Anyone over 65, they're still going to probably have mass quarantining. Anyone with these diseases, these are the like health risks. Cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, so obesity is going to be an issue. Severe asthma, chronic obstructive, so COPD, kidney failure, severe liver disease, immunodeficiency, and malignant cancer. That's what they're working with right now. Maybe as time goes on, they're like, oh, you know what? I don't know, liver disease people, you're actually fine, and you can still go out. But for now, those are the people who they're going to tell to stay home. They're talking about incentivizing employers to do testing. So think about maybe giving a $300 tax credit for employers to administer tests. And employers would want to do it because they want their employees to not have the disease so that they can come back to work, right? So you're probably going to see employers doing a lot more of these testing. This is the bad news. The original plans here that a consensus is building around would prohibit large gatherings. So no live sporting events. I mean, they could probably still have sporting events, but no live audiences. No concerts, no conventions, no theme parks. San Diego, they just canceled the fair, which is in a couple months. So there probably won't be anything like that, maybe throughout the whole summer. Bars and nightclubs, gyms would remain closed as well. They're thinking about restaurants opening later. So if we're putting timelines on this, so maybe May, June, we kind of start doing all this stuff, but restaurants probably wouldn't open until the end of June or July. That's kind of the timeline people are thinking of. And then even then, they would open them, but they'd be some health code of you can only have a certain number of people and the tables have to be a certain distance apart, but that's not gonna work for restaurants, right? Like restaurants, like the restaurants figure it out. They're like, we need 100 people in this restaurant at all times in order to make money. We can't be in business with just 50 people ordering food. We'd have to double the prices, right? So I don't know how many restaurants are gonna be able to do. You can't just say, well, half as many tables. And there's thoughts out there that if you wanna, we may get to the point where if you wanna travel on air or Amtrak, you would need to get tested and like prove you're tested and negative and confirm that you have this app, the contact tracing app, so that may happen. There's talk out there of having the federal government allow states to block off travel from people from other states coming in, right? So if you're in Texas and Louisiana has an outbreak, you would ban people from coming in from Louisiana. That's already happened, but like long-term for that, that's really weird, right? Like we haven't had anything like that since the Civil War. It's an odd, I don't think, that's an odd thing. And also regulating interstate traffic, commerce is a federal issue, so that's constitutionally tricky as well. There's suggestions that hotels should be turned into COVID-only hospitals so that hospitals can open up for other people. You think about all the people who are having heart attacks or like the chest pain and other things who aren't going to the hospital now, and their death rates for things like that are gonna go up because people are scared to go to the hospital or concerned about going. So we need to open up hospitals, but we gotta move COVID people to other places. So I think we'll start seeing some more of that. We gotta start letting doctors and nurses work in any state, so we gotta get rid of some regulatory issues there, like licensing issues. And then the suggestions are to keep making ventilators since it is believed by some, that a second outbreak could be much, much worse. Okay, that's the plan now. What do you think? It's called the hammer and the dance, right? We're in the hammer right now, the end of the hammer phase, then you got this dance phase to kind of keep it below. I've heard the analogy of like the light switch has been turned off and you don't turn it back on, it's like a dimmer. So this is part of like slowly dimming things back up. I think one thing that's really tricky about this is the idea that we can do this dance. You know, if the cases get too high, then we can do some more quarantines until they get low again, and then we'll let people back out. Like the idea that we can do that, even if you think that sounds good, like I think that sounds crazy, but even if you think that sounds good, that's really hard to do because there's such a lag. There's weeks lag between transmission and then getting sick and then being in the hospital. So like it's like super arrogant to think that we can just dial it like this. So you have this lag, but then you also have massive delays and problems with accuracy in counting people on whether or not they're sick or dying from COVID or whatever. So the reporting has a lag as well on top of the lag of the virus itself. So listen, I don't know how you get out of this. You know, you can just say open up, but the same thing's gonna, but that's what they're thinking. That's, whether you like it or not, that seems to be the consensus that people are rallying behind. Are you okay with it? Coming up next, talk to Dr. Mark Bruce. We'll get some insight from him medically, and then I want to come back at the end and talk about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They may be the ones who started this darn thing. I heard Scott Adams, he tweeted the other day, he said the reason China's opened up their wet markets is because this thing didn't come from a wet market. Talk about that coming up. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back. I want to go to one of our favorite guests, Dr. Mark Bruce. He's an emergency room doctor, ambassador to Belize and Canada for the American College of Emergency Physicians. And I want to talk about his new book in a second here too. Jackie, A Boy and a Dog, a warm Cold War story. And I want to do it because I want some good news. I want a nice heartwarming story for the love of Pete. But before we do that, Doctor, thank you for being here, first of all. I got a short-term question and then a long-term question when it comes to the virus. So since last we talked, what are you hearing? What are you hoping for in terms of treatment and or cure that you think is promising or not?
There's good news on that front. I mean, we're getting a lot of good data out of several different clinical trials. Some of those use combination medications, some of them single medication. Some of the more interesting and probably widely available and applicable to most people that would get COVID-19 would be the ones with hydroxychloroquine, which is a malaria drug. There's several trials with that as a single agent, varying dosages in some of those trials. And some of them are in combination with azithromycin, which is a very commonly used antibiotic, and also with zinc too. So those are kind of the trials for your average, not severely infected type of patient with COVID-19. Some of the issues with those medications have to do with cardiotoxicity and some abnormal heartbeats. Kids in particular, you have to be pretty careful with using those medications. But that aside, patients that don't have too much risk associated with heart disease or have other medications that can cause abnormal heartbeats are probably going to be really good candidates for that. And that medication is going to, I think, within the next month or so, going to be widely available.
Oh, wow. Is this for patients who are earlier in their conditions or later?
Yeah, mild to moderate disease. These would be patients that would not require ICU admission. For those patients,
but in the hospital.
You're correct. Or even patients that have moderate symptoms that have some risk. For example, maybe they're not that sick, but they've got hypertension or known heart disease, or they have diabetes. Those are patients that may be good candidates for this. We want to be sure that we have the right data for who gets what medication at what dose for how long, because, like I say, you don't want the cure to be worse than the disease.
Yeah. So what do I need to understand when it comes to clinical trials and how long that takes and what variables you need to think about when you're going through that process?
Well, again, you want to collect that data as much as possible. That has been a process that's been ongoing really for several weeks, maybe even as long as 6 weeks. Some of those trials have been going on. So we're starting to get that data back and be able to process that and see, gee, does this really work? You try and do this in what we call a double-blind fashion, which is kind of the crux of medical science in terms of legitimate studies that really don't have a lot of investigational bias. In other words, you don't want to have what you want to see happen reflected in a bad report in terms of a not accurate report in terms of that data. The double-blind.
Can you run us through? Yeah, can you run us through the double-blind? Can you run us through that process real quick?
So what you do is you set up two groups of patients, and you have one group of patients that will maybe get a placebo, and another group of patients that get the real deal, the medication that you're trialing. They don't know, and the investigators don't know who's getting what, so that there's no bias in terms of the results that you get. Then you look at recovery times, you look at side effects, and you compare this to, and you would want to see that one group did better than the other. So you would want to see that, okay, the medication, in this case, hydroxychloroquine, would produce a better, faster, more complete cure rate than what your placebo would. That would be the desirable outcome.
There's a lot there, because what if you're the placebo guy, right? And you wanted the treatment, but then it's also maybe the treatment's bad and you don't want the treatment, right? So that's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a whole medical ethical process that you enter into, and that patients understand when they're entering this trial. And the patients have actively been recruited for this process, like I say, over the last several weeks.
Well, I'm grateful for all of them. Grateful for people who are willing to try things, and grateful for the people who end up getting the placebo and maybe don't get the treatment that they otherwise could have. Whew, that's a lot. Okay, last question on this. When you do a trial like that, how do you not conclude like, well, it just so happened that the people in the first group were younger and maybe not as overweight or something, and like that's the variable? How do you isolate the different variables that could have like smoking, for instance? Like I've heard that some of the numbers back, smokers actually have a way lower rate of getting hospitalized, way lower than we thought. So how do you isolate different variables is my question.
You try and include the same variables in each group so that that's how you want to eliminate as many variables as possible whenever you do this kind of study, but you want to be sure that the same variables apply to each group.
Okay, geez, that's an amazing process. But as you said, it takes time. All right, my big picture question, and I want to go quick because I want to make sure we leave time for your book. Mutation. Viruses obviously are mutating all the time. Do you have any concern that this thing will mutate? And I guess my bigger question is, do viruses mutate to become less virulent or more virulent generally? And do you have a concern with COVID mutating?
The short answer to your question is yes. That's kind of the nature of viruses. That's why when we get an influenza vaccine, we're actually being vaccinated against usually anywhere between 2 to 4 different strains, because we know that those strains can actually mutate. So it's a bi, tri, or quadrivalent type of vaccine. Same thing's probably going to be true with COVID-19. We have seen strains, but they do not appear to be more virulent one to the other. The concern that we have is that this family of viruses, particularly MERS and SARS, are much more virulent, have a much higher death rate than what COVID-19 does.
So is it possible they could come together where you have the spread rate of COVID and the death rate or whatever of some MERS?
Yeah, that's always a possibility.
Okay, well, let's end on a better note. And I'm just so grateful for your knowledge there, Doctor. Thank you for that. But I'm also grateful for your book, Jackie, A Boy and a Dog, A Warm Cold War Story. So changing gears here completely. Put me in a good mood here, sir. Take us back. What happened?
Yeah, this is a great story. It's a story that's really rich in history. It goes back to the early space race. My dog that was gifted to me by John and Jackie Kennedy during their White House days, my dog's grandmother was the first dog the Russians sent up in a Sputnik to come back alive. That was Strelka. Strelka basically had a litter of pups after her reentry. One of those pups was Pushinka, and Pushinka became a gift of state from Premier Khrushchev to the Kennedy family at the 1961 Vienna Summit Conference. Well, the Kennedys loved dogs, and they entered the White House with just one dog, and that was Charlie. He was a Welsh Terrier. He was Jack's favorite. He was Jack's swimming companion in the White House pool. And Charlie was kind of the alpha dog in the White House kennels as additional dogs began to be added. But Charlie brought great solace to the president during some of the dark days of the presidency, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I relate a story in my book about that. But it's always amazing to me the power, the comfort that dogs can actually give us. I mean, it's unconditional love that they give us. And I grew up as a little boy in central Missouri in Columbia with a love for dogs and a love for baseball. And those two came together in a very tragic accident that I had when I was 10 years old, right about the time that, about a week before, Charlie sired a litter of pups by Pushinka. Charlie and Pushinka fall in love in the spring of 1963, and a week after, I accidentally killed my own dog in a very tragic accident. I was listening to Paul Harvey, and Paul Harvey comes on his noontime broadcast and says, they just had a litter of pups at the White House. What are they going to do with all those dogs? Well, they did. They had about 5 dogs before this litter was born, being other people gifting the Kennedy family with dogs. And And so I'm thinking to myself, boy, I need a dog. Nobody in the world needs a dog more than I do. And so I sat down and wrote a letter to the Kennedy family and said, I killed my dog. Can I have one of yours? That is more or less really what I said. And I had full expectation that why wouldn't they give me a dog? So a week later, I get a letter back from the White House, and they say, look, we're really sorry to hear your sad story, but we're not going to give any of the dogs away. And I thought that was the end of it. And I went to plan B, which was to bug my parents, let's go to the dog pound and get a dog. Because we didn't call it the Humane Society, it was the dog pound. And we didn't have a lot of money. We couldn't go to a breeder and purchase a purebred. And so every day it was an excuse of the day that why we couldn't do that. We were going to be going on a trip next week, or no, we need a fence before we get another dog, or whatever. Until August 18th of 1963, my dad was a minister. He was at church doing preaching a couple of services, when I was at home with my mom getting ready to go to church, and the phone rings. And we would always get a lot of phone calls on Sunday. It was needing to pick somebody up for Sunday school, or a teacher needing to stay home with a sick child. But so I picked the phone up. I was ready to go and just waiting for everybody else to get fluffed and buffed ready for church. And it was the White House. It was Evelyn Lincoln, the president's personal secretary, calling, and she asked for Master Bruce, meaning me. But, I wasn't used to being called master around my house. And so I thought she meant Mr. Bruce, but I couldn't figure out why. I was 10 years old. Why wouldn't she call my dad Reverend Bruce like everybody else did? So I hand the phone over to my mother, and Mom's got a smile on her face, and she's a lot more animated than what she is with most Sunday morning phone calls. And she hangs the phone up and she says, Mark, that was the White House, and they've decided to give you a dog. And when the president calls and wants to give you something, you don't say no. And so I heard the part about I'm getting a dog, and I was absolutely ecstatic. And so I told my dad, I told my father about this whenever we got to church, and he didn't believe me. He thought this was a joke. And it wasn't until after church we go home and we find the press corps camped out on our front lawn waiting for our arrival home from church that it really, the reality really began to sink in.
Hilarious. So I want to, Dr. I want to cut you off there, A, because we're out of time, but B, I want to leave the rest of the story for people who buy the book. Because that's not the end of it. And I love hearing the description you say, you talk about God. Actually, let's do that for 30 seconds. Where does God fit into this story for you?
Oh, God used Jackie as an instrument of his grace in my life, and really equipped me to do the same thing for so many people I've touched in my medical work around the world. Yes. And so this is really a book about God's grace and the relationship that Jackie and I had over the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Oh, what an amazing, pivotal moment in a boy's life that turns you into the man and also the career that you've gone on to have. That's fantastic. All right, the book is Jackie, a Boy and a Dog, a Warm Cold War Story. And I smiled that whole time, Doctor, and I haven't in a while. So thank you for that, sir. Let's talk again, Doctor. Thanks for all your work.
You're welcome, Mike.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Mark Bruce. Again, Jackie, a Boy and a Dog, a Warm Cold War Story. More coming up. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So I have no idea what this 5G thing is all about. I don't have the energy to wade into that conspiracy theory, to be honest. One of these days I will, for kicks. But there's this other conspiracy theory that was thrown around. I remember hearing it a while back, and it's this idea that this virus was created in a bioweapons laboratory in Wuhan, and China released it and spread it purposefully around the world. I remember I first heard that months ago, and I thought, I don't know. I'm not much of a conspiracy theory guy, right? So I was like, I don't know. So I kind of put it aside. seems that we now have a little more nuance to that story. This is a Washington Post article. It came out the other day. State Department cables warned safety issues at Wuhan lab studying bat coronaviruses. Excuse me? 2 years ago, quote, U.S. embassy officials visited a Chinese research facility in the city of Wuhan several times and sent 2 official warnings back to Washington about inadequate safety at the lab, which was conducting risky studies on, I don't know, coronaviruses from bats. All right? Are you serious? It'd be one thing if they were studying, I don't know, like the sniffles on dogs or what, but coronaviruses on bats. It's called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And in 2015, congratulations to them, they were the first lab in China to achieve the highest level of international bioresearch safety, level BSL-4. I don't know who gives that level. Maybe the bats. Or maybe the World Health Organization. I don't know. I really don't know who grants that level. It could be the World Health Organization. I wouldn't be surprised. I'll do some research on that. So a U.S. delegation went to visit, and they said, what the heck is going on here? Because the visit didn't go well. What the U.S. officials learned during their visits concerned them so much that they dispatched 2 diplomatic cables. The cables warned about safety and management weaknesses at the lab and proposed more attention and help. The first cable also warns that the lab's work on bat coronaviruses and their potential human transmission represented a risk of a new SARS-like pandemic. Well, gosh golly, wouldn't you know? So really, when this thing broke out months ago, whenever it was, there were the people in this delegation, whoever they were, who were like, yeah, I know. I saw this coming years ago, people. This is January 19th, 2018. During interactions with scientists at the laboratory, they noted a new lab has a serious shortage of appropriately trained technicians and investigators needed to safely operate this high containment laboratory. Okay, just before the U.S.'s visit, their team had published research showing that horseshoe bats they'd collected from a cave in Yunnan province were very likely from the same bat population that spawned the SARS coronavirus in 2003. More importantly, the cable states the research also showed that various SARS-like coronaviruses can interact with ACE2, the human receptor identified in SARS coronavirus. The findings strongly suggest that SARS-like coronaviruses from bats can be transmitted to humans to cause SARS-like diseases. So here's the nuance. When I first heard this a while back, it was this idea that the Chinese government designed a bioweapon and released it purposely into the world. And like, that's a lot, right? But maybe the virus did start in a lab and somehow escaped the lab. One of the US officials in the article says this cable was a warning shot. They were begging people to pay attention to what was going on. Now, I want to make it more sketchy. My last quote here. Research by Chinese experts published in The Lancet in January, it's a medical journal, showed the first known patient, identified on December 1st, had no connection to the market. Nor did more than 1/3 of the cases in the first large cluster. Also, the market didn't sell bats. Now, we're told that this came from bats at a wet market, but the guy didn't go to a wet market and there were no bats there. Now, this information comes from China. Can't believe anything that comes out of China. Maybe this farmer's market from hell not only sold bats, they had like an entire section of bats. Like maybe it was buy 2, get 1 free bat day at the Wuhan wet market. You can't trust the communists, you have no idea. But they've reopened their wet markets. And as Scott Adams says, maybe it's because they know that this thing didn't even come from a wet market. This is a researcher at Berkeley. He says, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I think it's a legitimate question that needs to be investigated and answered. To understand exactly how this originated is critical knowledge for preventing this from happening in the future. When I come back, talk about how the media first reacted, specifically to Tom Cotton, when he first threw out this suggestion months ago. If you need any more evidence that the media is awful. We'll do that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. We're just here talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology is all. You know, the people who unleashed the coronavirus, COVID, on the world. Can't say that, though. Or you couldn't say that. Now you can. Now it's okay to say, I guess. Funny how that works. We talked yesterday about how the media, they're total garbage. Mainstream media, absolute, total waste of time, absolutely worthless. They have provided nothing positive to this entire conversation for a month. I still can't get over, I'm not gonna go to the whole thing because we got a lot to do here. Jake Tapper, who I like, Science Magazine, all these other, they get to talk to Dr. Fauci, okay? The guy. He's the #1 guy. And you get 5 minutes with Dr. Fauci, Jake Tapper. And Jake Tapper spends 3 of them trying to get him into a gotcha to say something bad about Trump so that Trump fires him, so that the media narrative can be complete that Trump doesn't listen to the experts and whatever. 3 minutes asking the same question. Should we have done it sooner? Should we have done it sooner? Should we have done it? You spend your time doing that. And I think all these people at the press briefings, you got your whole team up there, and they just continue to ask hack questions. It's unbelievable to me how worthless these people are. If you've enjoyed or feel like you've gotten something out of the way we've covered this COVID for the last month and a half, just know that I've gotten nothing from the mainstream media. I've turned in maybe once a week for a second. I'll turn on just to kind of see how ridiculous they are. New York Times has been pretty good. This story is the first one from the Washington Post. Other than that, we've done nothing from the mainstream media to get any of this information. They're so far behind. They're not talking about anything that matters or anything that's important. Just total waste. Just cut them out of your diet completely. They're awful. Am I clear? I feel like I've beat that horse. And the reason they're so awful is because they've brought all the tools that they've developed over decades, to this situation, right? These are just the tools they have. Trump bad, make drama, everyone's racist. And that's what they know. It's what they know how to do. And when there's a global pandemic, you'd think they would stop with the games, but they can't. They can't stop. Check out this story from CNN. This is just bonkers. I can't even wrap my head around this. This is the headline. China's PLA Navy is controlling coronavirus, and aircraft carriers deployment proves it, report says. That's a real headline in CNN. Check out the opening line here of this story. A Chinese naval flotilla headed into the Pacific over the weekend. Evidence that the People's Liberation Army Navy, that's the communist Navy, has done a much better job controlling coronavirus than the US Navy, according to a story posted on the PLA's English language website. What is that? What kind? I can't wrap my head around that. We've played examples of the media parroting Chinese numbers, right? So China comes out and they're like, oh, hey, great news, no new cases in Wuhan. Totally virus-free here, everybody. You're not allowed to come visit or anything, but totally fine. And the media's like, oh, look at that, no new cases in Wuhan. That's just parroting Chinese propaganda. Our media, it's unbelievable. They question and they nitpick the littlest things that our president says. Right, we played the clip of Fauci yesterday where he said he's taken the advice, he said the president has taken his advice on mitigation every single time Fauci's given his advice. And the first response from the media is, some woman says, are you saying this voluntarily? Like he's some sort of hostage or something. So our media criticizes everything out of our president's mouth, but they hear this from the Chinese government and they're like, oh, well, that's amazing. Unbelievable, no new cases out of Wuhan. Oh, China. Wow, you're doing a great job, China. Wish we could be more like you. Not an ounce of critical thinking with anything that comes out of China. It's unbelievable. I don't usually like funny names given to things like MSDNC. Like I don't. It's fine, but like I don't say that. Or like the New York slime. Like I don't. But I did hear this morning someone called it SHE-NN, like XI. SHE-NN. I think that one's pretty good. But so to get my point though, this isn't like we're just repeating numbers or whatever. This is straight communist state media, and CNN copies it and makes a story about it. Hey, look everyone, the Chinese Navy is doing a much better job controlling coronavirus. What are we doing? Like why does anyone consider this news? How are they still played in airports? Anyway, check out these headlines. To go back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was my safety school, by the way. Luckily, I got into my #1 school, but these are headlines when Tom Cotton, so Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, he's the first guy I've ever heard talk about this thing. My buddy, months ago, like January, sent me some committee hearing that Tom Cotton was leading, talking about this. And I was like, whatever, man, why are you saying this thing? So Tom Cotton was the first guy. So here is some headlines after he threw out the suggestion that this may come from a lab. Republican who floated virus conspiracy says common sense has been my guide. Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus conspiracy theory that was already debunked. Nearly 30% of Americans believe the coronavirus came from a lab. Can you believe those idiots? Despite complete lack of evidence. MSNBC, Cotton repeats coronavirus conspiracy theory despite evidence. I love when the media does that. These are my two favorite things the media does now. They'll say, President Trump says, comma, despite evidence, or lacking evidence, comma, and then, or the other one is, President Trump, comma, who is not a doctor, comma, says, blah, blah. You guys are the worst. I got more. CNN, Tom Cotton's playing a dangerous game with his coronavirus speculation. Tom Cotton spread a conspiracy theory about the coronavirus on Fox News. We'll get to that in a second. Don't listen to Senator Tom Cotton about coronavirus. Tom Cotton airs fake theory that coronavirus is leaked China bioweapon. USA Today, the claim is that the coronavirus began in a Chinese laboratory. We rate that claim false. And there's some from the Washington Post saying the same thing. Washington Post, this from a lab? Like, what, are you crazy, you idiot? And now the Washington Post running that story of State Department memos saying, hey, just so you know, there's a laboratory in Wuhan that's doing crazy experiments with coronaviruses in bats. And it doesn't seem like they really have it all together over there. And this is a problem because, if something goes wrong, then there could be a global coronavirus pandemic in 2018. But because Tom Cotton's a Republican, he said, wild conspiracy theory without evidence. Now, here's what Tom Cotton actually said on Fox News months ago. He said, we don't know where it originated. Tell me, when I read this, tell me if you think this is like tinfoil hat, like crazy guy here. We don't know where it originated, and we got to get to the bottom of that. We also know that just a few miles away from that food market is China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that researches human infectious diseases. Now, we don't have evidence that the disease originated there, but because of China's duplicity and dishonesty from the beginning, we need to at least ask the question to see what the evidence says. And China right now is not giving any evidence on that question at all. Oh, what a crazy psycho lunatic. Like super reasonable. So the media, they purposefully, that was like the clip, like don't listen to him on Fox News, right? That was like, they're purposefully acting as if an accidental release from a lab equals a purposefully engineered bioweapon released on the world. Those are different things. Like on that latter one, I'm bored with that one. But on the other one, like, oh yeah, it's totally reasonable that, I don't know, like the bat flew out or the bat got someone sick and someone got, right? Like that seems like totally within the realm of possibility. But the reason the media had to conflate those two is because any criticism of China is you can't criticize China. They're the ones who are handling this so much better than we are. We can't be critical of them. So they have to turn everyone into a wacky conspiracy theorist. I'll end with, this is John Noonan. He's the one who compiled all those headlines. So appreciate doing that, John. He said, let this yet be yet another moment for journalism to take a hard look inward and ask why trust in media has evaporated. For merely suggesting the possibility of lab origin, barrels of ink were spilled discrediting it, from people in absolutely no position to make such judgments. Reporters do not serve the public good by trying to shut down reasonable questions. Listen, stop watching the cable news, right? Just cut it out. Garbage in, garbage out. Stop putting the garbage in your body, in your mind, in your brain, in your soul. Why listen to these people? They're just wrong all the time. And if they're not wrong, they're praising and reprinting Chinese communist press releases. Like, you can't. Obviously, you're going to get much better than that here on The First. True story. Mike Slater. See you more tomorrow.